London, 1856. You're standing in a perfectly respectable Victorian drawing room. Heavy curtains, coal smoke, dark mahogany, and everywhere you look, ferns. Hundreds of them, every windowsill, every corner, hanging from the ceiling, growing inside elegant glass cases. It looks beautiful. It also happens to be one of the strangest obsessions Victorian Britain ever produced. They called it fern fever, or, if you preferred the scientific term, Pteridomania. Most people bought a few exotic plants, admired them for a season, and eventually moved on. One man didn't. One man became convinced that somewhere in the valleys of Wales grew a fern no botanist could classify, a specimen the locals refused to touch, and after bringing it home, he was never quite the same again. Tonight's story isn't about murder. It isn't about a ghost. It's about what happens when curiosity survives long after common sense has quietly left the room. Welcome back. This is the botanist's last hunt.
Tonight is about obsession. The particular creeping, absolutely Victorian kind. The kind that starts with a hobby and ends somewhere you can't quite find on any map. Stay with me on this one. It gets strange. First, and I promise this is relevant, we need to talk about why the Victorians lost their collective minds over ferns. Because it wasn't random. Nothing about the Victorians was random. Everything they did had layers to it. Social, economic, scientific, psychological, and Pteridomania was no different. It started, as most Victorian crazes did, with technology and status colliding at high speed. The Wardian case was a sealed glass container, essentially a miniature greenhouse, invented in the 1830s by a doctor named Nathaniel Ward, who discovered, almost by accident, that plants sealed inside glass could survive the polluted air of industrial London indefinitely. The case created its own little ecosystem, moisture recycled, temperature regulated. The outside world, the smoke, the soot, the sulphur dioxide that was quietly killing everything green within the city limits, kept at bay by a few panes of glass. Suddenly, people who had never successfully kept so much as a windowsill herb alive were cultivating exotic tropical species in their parlours. Ferns from Jamaica, ferns from the Cape of Good Hope, ferns from the darkest, dampest corners of the empire, sitting next to the tea service and the family portrait, looking startlingly, defiantly alive. And the Victorians, being the Victorians, immediately turned this into a competition.
Because a fern wasn't just a fern. A fern was a statement. The rarer the species, the more elaborate the case, the more your drawing room communicated, without a single word being spoken, that you were a person of culture, of means, of refinement. You had the education to appreciate natural science. You had the money to pursue it. You had the taste to display it properly. The middle classes went absolutely berserk for it. Nurseries couldn't keep up with demand, gardens were stripped, woodlands across Britain were picked nearly clean by enthusiasts who thought nothing of pulling up every specimen they found, filling their baskets to overflowing, and leaving hillsides bare behind them. William Hooker, director of Kew Gardens, was reportedly despairing about the destruction. Charles Kingsley, who actually coined the term Pteridomania, described ladies going, quote, fern crazy across the British Isles. It was, by any reasonable measure, a complete mania. And into this mania walked Silas Vane.
Silas Vane was, in 1850, a man of 42, a former schoolmaster turned private scholar, living alone in a tall, narrow terraced house in Islington on a modest inherited income. The kind of man who exists at the edges of Victorian society, educated enough to move in respectable circles, independent enough to largely avoid them. He had never married, he had few close friends. He corresponded extensively. Long, precise, extraordinarily detailed letters about botany, natural philosophy, and the emerging science of ecology, which was barely a science yet, and was still mostly just enthusiastic people arguing in journals.
He was, by every account, a perfectly pleasant man. Methodical, quiet, possessed of a dry, careful sense of humour that appeared occasionally in his letters, and then retreated, as if embarrassed by itself. He was also, even before the Ferns, a collector. Not a casual one, not the kind who picks up interesting things and arranges them on a shelf. The serious kind. The kind for whom collecting is not a pastime, but a calling, a systematic project of acquisition and documentation that never quite reaches completion, and is never intended to.
He'd collected beetles in his 20s, moths in his 30s. He had cabinets full of pressed flowers, drawers of geological samples, shelves of annotated natural history texts going back to the previous century. His house, a visitor once noted in a letter, felt less like a home and more like a private museum maintained by a single, extremely dedicated curator, which, in retrospect, was rather an accurate description. When Pteridomania arrived, Silas Vane did not catch it the way other people caught it. He didn't buy a fashionable Wardian case and fill it with common varieties to display to visitors. He didn't use it as a social occasion. He approached Ferns the way he approached everything, with the full, undivided, methodical intensity of a man who was constitutionally incapable of doing anything by halves. It started, as these things do, reasonably. A few common varieties. Hart's tongue, lady fern, the kind of things every enthusiast started with. Attractive, well documented, easily sourced from any reputable nursery in London. Silas documented each one, drew it, measured it, wrote up its characteristics in a series of notebooks that, by the end, would fill an entire shelf. He corresponded with botanists at Kew and at the Royal Horticultural Society. He read everything published on British pteridophytes. He visited collections, and then the common varieties stopped being interesting. This is the moment that separates the hobbyist from the obsessive, that precise point where the available, the documented, the already known stops being sufficient and the mind starts reaching further, where the question stops being, what can I find, and starts being, what hasn't been found yet. Within 2 years of beginning his collection, Silas had moved well past anything the fashionable nurseries could offer him. He was writing to collectors in Wales, in Ireland, in the remote Highland glens of Scotland. He was corresponding with botanists in continental Europe about species that existed in Britain only in isolated pockets. A single ravine in Herefordshire, a shaded gorge in Monmouthshire, a particular damp hollow on the Welsh border, where the conditions were, for reasons not entirely understood, uniquely hospitable to certain specimens found almost nowhere else. He began travelling to collect in person, weekend journeys that became week-long expeditions. The letters from this period show a man becoming progressively less interested in anything that isn't botany. Social engagements declined, correspondence with non-botanical acquaintances thinned, the outside world contracting steadily around the single point of his obsession. His notebooks from this period are meticulous, precise, and here and there beginning to contain observations that his Kew correspondents found difficult to categorise. Specimens that didn't quite match any documented variety.
frond shapes that fell outside the normal range, growth patterns that were, as Silas noted with characteristic understatement, somewhat anomalous. He found them interesting. More than interesting. He found them compelling.
I want to read you something from one of Silas Vane's notebooks, 1854. Specimen retrieved from the lower gorge, north of Lanthony. No immediate classification possible. Frond structure superficially resembles Asplenium rutamuraria, but the venation is entirely incorrect, branching in patterns I cannot account for within any documented species. The colour, a green so deep it reads almost black in direct light. I have kept it separate from the others. The others seem, if I may use the word without inviting ridicule, uneasy near it. The others seem uneasy near it. He was talking about plants. Now, I want to be careful here, because Silas Vane was not, at this point, a man losing his grip on reality. He was a trained observer, with 30 years of meticulous scientific habit behind him. When he wrote something down, he wrote what he actually observed, not what he imagined. And what he observed over the following 2 years was a collection of specimens that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain. The anomalous ferns, the ones from the deep gorges, the ones from the shaded ravines on the Welsh borderland, didn't behave like ordinary ferns. They grew faster. They responded to conditions that should have been unfavourable, and they had what Silas, in his careful, precise, slightly embarrassed scientific language, kept describing as an affect on the specimens around them. The other ferns, the common ones, the documented ones, declined in their presence. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, over weeks and months, the healthy specimens nearest to the anomalous ones would begin to lose vigour. Fronds yellowing, growth slowing, a gradual quiet retreat, while the anomalous specimens thrived. Silas noted all of this. He measured it, he documented it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. He wrote to Q. He included pressed specimens. Q, after some delay, responded that the specimens were interesting, but probably represented natural variation within known species, and that his observations about adjacent plant behaviour were suggestive but insufficiently controlled to draw firm conclusions. Silas read this response, filed it carefully, and went back to the Welsh borderlands. Because there was something else, something he hadn't mentioned in the letter to Q, something he'd only written about in the private notebooks. In the summer of 1855, Silas Vane began hearing about a specific specimen, not from scientists, not from botanists or collectors or anyone in the formal networks he moved through, from locals. The border country between England and Wales, the Marches, that ancient, contested, in-between landscape of deep valleys and older-than-memory hills, had its own relationship with the natural world. People who had farmed and grazed and moved through that landscape for generations had names for things that appeared in no botanical survey, no scientific text, no official record of any kind. One of those things was what the locals in one particular valley called, in the Welsh, something that translated approximately as the fern that remembers. Silas found the first reference in a letter from a farmer in Monmouthshire. He found a second in a conversation with an old woman in a village near Abergavenny. A third in a fragment of folklore preserved in a local church record, mentioning a plant that grew in a specific hollow above the river. A plant that, the record noted somewhat cryptically, should not be carried from its place.
He talked about it to me, or rather, he talked about it in the period before he stopped talking to people much at all. and he described it as the whispering fern, his own name for it since no scientific name existed. He said he believed it was a relic, a survivor from a time before the managed, documented, cultivated version of the natural world that the Victorians were so busily constructing. A plant that carried, and here is where the notebooks begin to shift in tone, become something other than purely scientific. A plant that carried memory, the memory of the earth from before it had been drained and cleared and paved and pressed into the service of human convenience.
He said the common ferns were, in his phrase, the scouts, the comfortable, familiar, drawing room varieties that kept people happy and distracted and feeling close to nature, while the real thing, the older thing, waited in the deep ravines, in the places where the light didn't quite reach and the soil was a colour that didn't appear elsewhere. Waited, he said, for the right kind of person to notice. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, because I am aware that this sounds, at this point in the story, rather more like Gothic fiction than Victorian natural history. But here is what I'd ask you to hold in mind. Silas Vane was not a fanciful man. He was not given to romanticism or supernatural thinking. His letters before 1854 are so dry, so methodical, so relentlessly empirical that they're nearly unreadable. He was the kind of person who described a beautiful sunset in terms of atmospheric particulate matter. The change in his writing is not the change of a man inventing things. It is the change of a man trying, with a scientific vocabulary that does not quite fit, to describe something he is genuinely observing. What he was observing, what he believed he had found evidence of, I will let you judge for yourselves. In October of 1855, Silas Vane travelled to the Welsh borderlands for the 7th time in 2 years. He had, by this point, narrowed his search to a specific area, a deep wooded gorge in Monmouthshire, accessible only by a path that was barely a path, a suggestion of intention through undergrowth and exposed root and slick, moss-covered stone. The valley floor was perhaps 50 feet below the surrounding land, cut by a stream that ran cold even in August, and the light, even at midday, arrived second-hand, filtered through a canopy so dense it felt less like sky and more like a ceiling. The locals, when he'd asked about the hollow, had been, he wrote, forthcoming about the location, but notably reluctant to accompany me to it. He went alone. He spent 2 days in the gorge, working his way along the stream bank, examining every inch of the rock faces and the root tangles and the shadowed corners where the moisture gathered and the temperature barely shifted between summer and winter. And on the second afternoon, in a recess where 2 rock faces met at an angle that excluded almost all light, he found it. He described it in the notebook entry for that evening, written by lamplight in the farmhouse where he was staying, his handwriting noticeably less steady than usual. The fronds measure approximately 14 inches. The colour is unlike any I have documented. Not merely a deep green, but something beneath green, as though the green were a surface quality, and what lay beneath were altogether different. The venation is complex beyond anything in the literature. I followed individual veins for several minutes with my glass and was unable to find where they terminated. The texture, not the smooth or slightly scaled texture of known specimens, but something that resisted the glass in a way I found difficult to account for, as if the surface were not quite resolved, as if it were still in the process of becoming. As if it were still in the process of becoming. He collected a specimen, carefully. He packed it with damp moss in a sealed case, the way he always transported delicate specimens.
He noted that the journey back up out of the gorge took considerably longer than the journey down, that the path seemed to have shifted in the hours he'd spent below, that he emerged at a point perhaps a quarter of a mile from where he'd entered. He attributed this to unfamiliarity with the terrain. He wrote the note with, he admitted, somewhat less certainty than he normally brought to his attributions.
Silas returned to Islington in late October 1855 with 17 new specimens and the thing from the gorge. He installed the gorge specimen in its own Wardian case, separate from the others, as he'd been doing with the anomalous specimens for 2 years now. The case went in his study, the room where he spent most of his time anyway, the room ringed with notebooks and correspondence and the accumulated evidence of 30 years of careful, methodical looking at the world. And then things began, very slowly, to change. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happened, and I think that's important to understand. There was no single moment, no obvious turning point, just a series of small shifts, the kind that you only recognise in retrospect, when you're looking back and trying to work out where the line was crossed. His correspondence thinned further. The letters from this period, November 1855, December, into 1856, become shorter, less engaged with the world outside the study. Questions from Q correspondence go unanswered for weeks, then months. Social invitations, the few he still received, are declined without explanation. He stopped going out much. He was in the study. He was always in the study.
His housekeeper of 12 years, a woman named Mrs. Alford, later told an interviewer that from November onwards she frequently found him at his desk at hours that suggested he hadn't been to bed, that he would sometimes not respond when spoken to directly, not because he was deaf or lost in thought, but because he was attending to something else, something she couldn't see. That the Fern case on his desk was, in her words, not like the others. The others I didn't mind. That one I didn't like to look at directly. She was a practical woman. She noted this without apparent embarrassment.
The notebooks from this period are extraordinary documents. Not because they become wild or incoherent. They don't. Silas Vane maintained his observational rigour almost to the end. The handwriting stays steady, the prose stays careful, the methodology stays intact. But what he is observing changes. The early entries from November 1855 are still largely botanical. Measurements, growth rates, comparisons with documented species, the usual apparatus of scientific note-taking. By December, something else has appeared alongside it. He begins recording what he calls communications. Not in a mystical sense. He's at considerable pains to note that he is not claiming anything supernatural, but in the sense of signals, information, patterns in the growth of the frond, in the way the specimen responds to light and temperature, that he becomes convinced are not random, that carry, in some form he cannot fully articulate, content. He writes on the 14th of December, "I have been watching the specimen for 4 hours this evening. The frond has moved twice, not in response to any air current I can detect, the case being sealed, but in what I can only describe as a considered motion. I am aware of how this reads. I record only what I observe." January 1856. I believe it is attempting to tell me something about where it came from. Not the gorge, before the gorge, before everything that came after the gorge. I lack the vocabulary for what it is showing me. I am not certain human vocabulary is adequate. February. I have not written to anyone in 3 weeks. There does not seem to be much point. What I am learning here is not something that translates into letters.
Motch. It is waiting. I understand now what waiting means when it is not a human thing doing the waiting. It is not impatient. It has no concept of impatient. It is simply present, in a way that makes my own presence feel very thin and very recent.
And then, in April, I think I should not have brought it here. I think it was not meant to travel. I think the people in the valley knew this, and I did not listen, because I was not the kind of person who listens to that kind of knowledge. I am not sure I know what kind of person I am now. The notebooks end in May 1856. Not abruptly. The final entry is dated, signed, written in Silas's usual hand. It is a single line. The Fern is not waiting anymore. Mrs. Alford arrived on the morning of the 17th of May to find the house silent in a way she described as different from the usual quiet. She found Silas Vane in his study, seated at his desk. He was alive, he was conscious, he was breathing normally, and his pulse, when she checked it in alarm, was entirely regular. He was simply sitting, looking at the Wardian case on his desk. He did not respond to her when she spoke. Not in the way he'd occasionally failed to respond before, not distracted or absorbed, but in a more fundamental way. He turned to look at her when she touched his shoulder. He registered her presence, his eyes focused on her face, and then he looked back at the case. A doctor was called, then another, then a specialist from the hospital who had an interest in what the Victorians called diseases of the mind, which covered a very wide range of things that nobody particularly understood yet. Silas Vane was not, by any clinical measure available in 1856, insane. He was not violent, he was not distressed, he ate when food was put in front of him, he slept when led to his bed. He would occasionally speak, but in fragments, partial sentences, things that seemed to be the tail ends of thoughts that had started somewhere else. The specialist wrote in his notes that the patient demonstrated a sustained withdrawal of attention from the external world that does not correspond to any condition I have previously encountered. He is present, he is simply not here. The Wardian case was removed from the study on the doctor's instruction. Silas watched it go. He did not protest, he simply watched. After it was removed, he seemed to, the word Mrs. Alford used later was surface, like something coming up from a depth. Over several weeks, he gradually returned to something resembling ordinary engagement with the world around him. He never spoke about the specimen. He never went back to Wales. He never opened another botanical notebook. He lived quietly in Islington for another 19 years, until his death in 1875. By every account, he was gentle, pleasant, and entirely uninterested in plants of any kind. His study was never quite the same, Mrs. Alford said. Something in the air of it had changed. She couldn't say what. What happened to the specimen from the gorge? The doctor who ordered its removal arranged for it to be sent to a colleague at a botanical institution. He doesn't name which one in his notes. The specimen was received, logged, and placed in storage. There is a record of its arrival. A brief description matching Silas's own notes, the unusual colouring, the complex venation, the texture that resisted straightforward examination. There is no subsequent record of it, no further documentation, no formal classification, no record of disposal or transfer. It was received, and then it is simply not there in the records anymore. The gorge in Monmouthshire is still there. The path down to it is still, by accounts of people who've walked that landscape, barely a path.
a suggestion of intention through undergrowth and root and stone. The valley floor is still 50 feet below the surrounding land, cut by a stream that runs cold even in August. The light still arrives second-hand. Whether anything grows in the recess where the two rock faces meet, I genuinely cannot tell you. I don't think I'd go to check.
Right. So, what do we actually do with Silas Vane? Because here's the thing about Pteridomania, and here's where it connects to something larger than one man and one specimen and one gorge in Monmouthshire. The Victorian collecting frenzy was genuinely, demonstrably catastrophic for British wildlife. The fern populations of Wales, Ireland and the Scottish Highlands were stripped to near nothing in less than a generation. Species that had grown undisturbed for thousands of years were hauled out of their ecosystems by enthusiastic amateurs who wanted to display them next to their tea sets. Most of those people meant no harm. They weren't malicious. They were simply doing what their culture told them was admirable: collecting, documenting, domesticating, bringing the wild world into the managed world and arranging it to human satisfaction.
The idea that some things were better left where they were, that removal from context was itself a kind of violence, that some relationships between a living thing and its place were not transferable. That wasn't a Victorian idea. It barely exists as a mainstream idea even now. Silas Vane got there, eventually, in May 1856, in a study in Islington, sitting in front of a sealed glass case. I think I should not have brought it here. He was a collector who collected one thing too many. Or perhaps more accurately, one thing too specifically. One thing that was not, in any sense that mattered, meant to be collected. And the lesson, if there is one, if we're allowed to extract lessons from stories like this, is not really about ferns. It's about the assumption. The very Victorian, very persistent, very human assumption that the world is there to be understood by taking it apart. That the right response to something remarkable is to remove it, contain it, document it, make it yours.
Sometimes the remarkable thing is remarkable precisely because it is where it is. Sometimes the hollow in the gorge and the thing in the hollow are not two separate things. Sometimes the people who tell you it should not be carried from its place are not being superstitious. Sometimes they're just right. Right. That's Silas Vane and the Whispering Fern. Leave a comment below, and if you ever find yourself in a deep gorge on the Welsh border, following a path that's barely a path, and you come across something growing in a shadowed recess that doesn't quite match anything you've seen before, take a photograph. Leave the fern where it is. See you next.